Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to another history lesson where we will be focusing on civil resistance in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. Remember, these lessons are meant to help you succeed in your exams. Now, remember that with the civil society resistance in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, there are lots of sub-themes that you have to know, like the challenges of black consciousness, Soweto uprising, 1980s, and international resistance. Please make sure that you study all of them because questions can come from any of those sub-themes. There are also essential skills that are for history that we will be looking at today, like how to define words in your own words, how to understand historical concepts, analyzing posters, interpreting sources, and extracting evidence and relevant information from the sources. So, the objectives of this lesson are analyzing sources, applying knowledge to interpret information from the sources, extracting relevant information from the sources, evaluating the usefulness and limitation of the source, and how to analyze a poster. Those are very important. Please make sure that you know them by the end of the lesson. You also need to remember that there are keywords or historical concepts that go with a theme. So you should be able to define them in your own words, like black consciousness, uprising, reform, constitution, repression, trade union, homeland. Make sure what they mean and you can define them in your own words. Others can be civil organizations, sanctions, disinvestments. There is also prior knowledge that you should have from your other grades, like grade 10 and 11, in order to understand this theme. Now, very important that you understand cause and effect, explain historical terms in your own words, identify limitations of their sources, and interpret and analyze posters. So coupled with your history skills, there are also very important exam skills that you have to have, like time management, comprehension skills, communication skills, active learning, and reading so that you can analyze your questions properly. So we will be looking at all those skills to help you succeed in your exams. So what we're going to do now, we are going to take a very, very short commercial break. And when we come back after the break, we are going to look at examples of questions to show you how you can apply your skills. I will see you shortly. Welcome back. Now let's look at examples so that you know how to apply the skills that are important in history. Now, the skills problem is that a lot of people cannot comprehend historical concepts. Remember those concepts we looked at before the break, like black consciousness, uprising, reform, and so on. Please make sure that you study those and you know them very well so that you can define them in your own words. Okay. So there's also lack of comprehension and interpretation of sources. So these words, like black consciousness, you should be able to define them in your own words. Even if the definitions are given in the sources, please make sure that you can define them in your own words. Black consciousness, uprising, reform, constitution, repression, trade union, homeland, any word that goes with this theme of civil resistance in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. Now, let's look at an example from a past paper. First example says, define the term tricameral parliament in your own words. So I'm underlining in your own words because that is very important. Okay, now, if you look at the source, it tells you, the source below explains the reasons why P.W. Botha, President of the Republic of South Africa, introduced reforms in 1983. And then it reads, he set out his plan to establish a tricameral parliament, so there is the word that you have to define in your own words, in which the mixed race, colored and Indian minorities would have separate chambers to legislate their own affairs. while the existing, much larger, whites-only House of Assembly would deal with both white issues and the nation's general affairs. So the definition is already there in the source, but then you have to try and define it in your own words. So the solution to this question is that the tricameral parliament was a three-chamber parliament for white, colored, and Indian representatives, while Africans were excluded. Another explanation is the tricameral parliament had three, so it's very, very important to include three because it's tri, which means three. It was three separate chambers where colored and Indian representatives were made to believe they could oversee their own affairs, while whites dealt with their affairs of all. Very important to include that word three. Another example is explain the term boycott in the context of the UDF's reaction during the elections for the tricameral parliament. That is out of 2 marks. The caption reads, the source below, taken from a newspaper article titled Indian Turnout About 20% in South African Elections, was written by Alistair Sparks for the Washington Post on the 29th August 1984. I'm going to highlight that because it's important. It explains why there was a low turnout from both Indians and coloreds in the tricameral elections in 1984. And then it reads, since many people who were eligible to vote did not register, so they did not register, that's important, particularly among the coloreds, leaders of the boycott movement were claiming tonight that the effective vote in the two elections was about 18% out of a joint population of 3.5 million. Now, possible solution there is that call by the UDF for people not to vote and stay away from the elections for their tricameral parliament. Stay away from the voting stations as they were not in favor of the tricameral parliament because it continued with the implementation of apartheid. So those are the possible responses. Now, let's look at another very important history skill, and that is interpreting sources. Very important to know how to interpret sources and to understand cause and effect. This is what happened, and it led to that. So the guidelines when you're interpreting sources, you have to read the caption because it gives you context of what the source is about. Who wrote it, when it was written, where it was written, and so on. You have to underline or highlight the key events or actions, highlight the key role players and their actions, look for reactions or consequences, and then if you're given a visual source, you have to look for visual clues that will help explain the different events. Now, let's look at the example. Explain the meaning of Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak's statement, and this is the statement. The Homelands policy forms the basis of the willful exclusion of 80% of our nation from the new political ideal. Again, look at the mark allocation. That means you have to give 2 points because it's out of 4 marks. The source below is an extract from a speech delivered by Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak at the launch of the United Democratic Front, UDF, at the Rockland Civic Center in Mitchell's Plain on the 20th of August 1983. It focuses on the formation and intentions of the UDF. And then it says, the Homelands policy forms the basis of the willful exclusion of 80% of our nation from the new political deal. Clearly, the oppression will continue. The apartheid line is not all abolished. Possible response there, that is interpreting evidence from the source. Africans who were in the majority in South Africa at 80% were excluded. Very important. They were excluded from the tricameral parliament. Africans would be catered for through the Homelands policy. The apartheid policy of divide and rule was maintained. Now, when you're looking at limitations of the sources, you have to look for the author of the source. You have to know when the source was written, why it was written, who published it, and then you look at the content. Which words or language are used, which information is left out. That will help you interpret the source and also understand what it is about. Later on, when you ask for limitations, also understand that. Now, another example is, why would a historian consider this source to be reliable? So this speaks to evaluating sources regarding the launch of the UDF. Again, you have to give 2 points because it says 2 times 2 equals 4. The source below is an extract from a speech delivered by Reverend Dr. Alan Boesak at the launch of the United Democratic Front, UDF, at the Rocklands Civic Center in Mitchell's Plain on 20 August 1983. It focuses on the formation and intentions of the UDF. Now, possible responses there. The source is reliable because it was delivered by Dr. Alan Boesak. The caption tells you. Okay, and he was one of the leaders of the UDF. The speech was delivered on the 20th of August 1983, which was the actual date of the launch of the UDF. It highlights the reasons for the launch of the UDF, which was in response to the introduction of the apartheid reforms and the establishment of the tricameral parliament. So I'm going to underline, highlights the reasons for the launch. That makes it reliable because it highlights the reasons for the launch of the UDF. The information in the source can be corroborated with other sources. So that obviously comes from having read the entire paper to see what the other sources say. I hope all that helps you understand how to not only comprehend or understand the sources, but also how to interpret them, and also the importance of reading and analyzing the caption, because you will find that when you're answering such questions, a lot of the information will be contained in the caption itself. You don't even have to think hard about how to answer that question. So what we're going to do now, we are going to take a very short commercial break. And when we come back from the break, we are going to look at more historical skills to help you succeed in your exams so that you know exactly what to do. I will see you soon. Welcome back. Now let's look at more skills and how to apply them when answering questions in history. The problem here is poor comprehension of sources and difficulty extracting relevant information from the sources. So it's very important that by the end of this lesson, you know how to do that. Now, what you need to do is you need to highlight the keywords, read the caption in order to understand context, because remember the caption will give you the date, the place, and all the relevant information you need. You have to underline the key events and people, read the glossary to understand the difficult terms, and where you're asked to extract information from the sources, please do not give your own knowledge, but just extract the information as you are told. Now, let's look at the first example. Name 2, so it's name, do not discuss, 2 apartheid statutes and the source that P.W. Botha scraped while introducing reforms to the apartheid policy. You can see there it's 2 times 1 equals 2. He scraped what he called outdated and unnecessary apartheid statutes or laws. So if in the question you did not understand the meaning of the word statutes, it's there in the source, it's the laws, such as the outlawing of mixed marriages and sex across color line, to present a new image of reformism or change to the world. So if you look at the solution there, it tells you it's mixed marriages and sex across color line. That is straight from the source. So that is extracting evidence from the source. Another example is identify 4. Okay, please read your questions carefully. Legislative powers in the source that the white minister had over black urban councils. Now the source says, but even these urban councils were not autonomous or free. The legislation enabled the white minister to remove members. So very important to highlight those things because you also can see cause and effect. Appoint others or dismiss the whole council and appoint a new one. So he could dismiss people, he could appoint new people. It meant that the black councils had to implement government policy rather than be responsive to their electorates. That is what the source says. So if you look at the solution, it does say exactly those things that are underlined in the source. Things like remove members, appoint others, dismiss the whole council, or appoint a new one. Another very important skill that you have to know is how to analyze visual sources. Now, let's look at the poster. It says, explain what is implied by the words in the poster. Don't vote in apartheid elections. So you'll find those words appear in the poster itself, but then you have to interpret those, okay, and in your own words. You have to do that in the context of the UDF's resistance to the introduction of the tricameral parliament in 1983. Now let's read the caption. The poster below, published and distributed by the UDF in 1983, is directed at Botha's call for elections for a tricameral parliament. It urges all white, colored, and Indian South Africans not to participate in the apartheid elections. So, even before you look at the poster, the caption tells you what the poster is about. So then don't forget to look for visual clues. So you can see there it does say, don't vote in apartheid elections. And then there are other words there that say forward to freedom that you can use when answering your questions. Now let's look at the solution there. White, colored, and Indian voters were encouraged to boycott the tricameral parliament. We did see that from the source, or the tricameral parliament elections. The UDF's Don't Vote campaign was to create an awareness that the tricameral parliament, I'm going to underline awareness, elections would continue apartheid despite the proposed changes. The elections were deemed to be apartheid elections because the blacks were excluded from participating in the elections. The UDF was discouraging the divide and rule strategy of the apartheid government. So those are all the possible responses you can look at. Another question says, comment on the slogan, forward to freedom. Remember, I did underline that in the poster as well. Held by the UDF supporters in the context of resistance to P.W. Botha's reforms. So if you look at the possible solution there, it says, the slogan refers or infers that the tricameral parliament would not provide freedom. Because it says forward to freedom, it means the tricameral parliament would not provide freedom. Another possible response would be the UDF would, through protest action, achieve freedom. Now you can see that word freedom keeps appearing because it is the word that is there in the source when it says forward to freedom. Another possible solution is people must be mobilized or they must unite in strength to attain freedom. Now you can see all these possible solutions or answers to this question have the word freedom in them to show you that you have to make that link between what is said in the source and the response that you are going to give to show your own understanding of the source or interpretation of the source. So that is very important, as I did with you before, that you highlight or you underline visual clues that are found in the source to understand what the source is about. I hope that has helped you understand how to interpret sources in history. We looked at comprehension skills. We looked at how to extract relevant information from the sources and not use your own words. Only use your own words when you're asked to define terms or concepts in your own words. And then we analyzed a poster looking at visual clues to help you analyze that poster. Now let's look at examples from past papers to help you apply your historical skills. First question reads, what, according to the UDF, was the Mass Democratic Movement, or MDM, expected to achieve? So this is about achievements, so it speaks to cause and effect in the struggle against apartheid, and give 2 responses. Please make sure that you do that, and you can see the mark allocation there. So the source reads, the UDF introduced the term Mass Democratic Movement, or MDM, and it said that MDM should strengthen grassroots structures and bring all those organizations on the periphery or the sidelines, thus involving them in the struggle. Many previously excluded groups, including white groups and homeland groups, were invited to an anti-apartheid conference organized by COSATU in September 1988. The government did not approve and banned the conference. Now, possible answer there is to strengthen the grassroots structures. Straight extraction from the source. You're not analyzing, you're not explaining, you're just taking the information as it is. To bring all those organizations in the periphery, thus involving them in the struggle. So that is how you extract relevant information from the source. Now let's look at another example there. Comment on the implication of the statement, a condition for affiliation with the MDM was adherence to the provisions of the ANC's Freedom Charter in the context of the struggle against apartheid. Now the source reads, or part of the source, like the UDF, the MDM drew much of its support from the black community. A condition for affiliation with the MDM was adherence to the provisions of the ANC's Freedom Charter. So now, the possible solution there is all organizations wanting to be part of the MDM should adopt the demands of the ANC's Freedom Charter. The struggle for liberation waged by the MDM was aimed at the realization of the fundamental principles of the Freedom Charter, which affiliates had to embrace. Another possible response is organizations joining MDM must be anti-apartheid. Let's look at another example of how to apply your skills. Explain why you think COSATU supported the campaign for disinvestment against the apartheid government. Now, the source reads, in policy guidelines adopted at the launching conference, the Congress also came out in support of disinvestment or withdrawal of investment, so that helps you understand the term disinvestment, as well as the eventual nationalization of South Africa's mines and other major industries. Okay, so you have to explain why you think COSATU supported that campaign. Possible solution or response: to put pressure on the South African government to change or dismantle its apartheid policy, to isolate South Africa from the rest of the world, cutting it off from foreign economic support. Very, very important, because that is disinvestment, by imposing sanctions or forcing it to capitulate. COSATU was aligned to the ANC, which used the disinvestment tactic to intensify the fight against apartheid, to force the apartheid government to change its policies, which in turn would lead to better working conditions for the workers. So it's any relevant point there. Okay, I hope that has helped you understand how to analyze sources and practice your history skills so that you do very, very well in your exams. So now we are going to take a very short commercial break, and when we come back after the break, we are going to look at more examples to help you analyze questions and practice your exam writing skills. Welcome back. Let's look at more examples to help you apply your skills to answer exam questions. This question reads, why according to the source? Please make sure that it is according to the source, not according to your own knowledge, not according to you, but according to the source. Did the newly launched COSATU threaten to call a national strike? Now the source reads, leaders of the new super federation had already threatened to call a national strike if the government carries out its threat to repatriate or send back migrant workers and have pledged to organize workers in their homelands in defiance of any restrictions on unions in these regions. So that is information in the source. Possible solution there is that if the government carries out its threat to repatriate migrant workers, straight extraction from the source. Another possible one is, and have pledged to organize workers in the homelands in defiance of any restrictions on unions in these regions. Another example is, identify evidence in the source that indicates that this was a COSATU poster. Now remember the poster we looked at before the commercial break. The caption read, the poster below, designed by COSATU's media worker, Patrice Cocaine, demonstrate COSATU's protest against the apartheid government's Labour Relations Amendment Act that was introduced in 1987. So now you have to identify evidence, so that means the visual clues in the source that indicates that this was a COSATU poster. So this is the poster there. You can see it says no to the Labour Bill. I'm going to circle that. No to restrictions. And then it also says forward with COSATU Special Congress. So you can see the words COSATU are included in the poster there. Possible solutions there. The COSATU logo or name appears in the poster. There are also words, forward with COSATU, or an injury to one is an injury to all. Special Congress taking place in Johannesburg on May the 14th to the 15th, 1988. It has the words workers, no to the Labour Bill. Remember those words I circled? No to restriction, organize, resist, factories. So look for all the visual clues there that show you that that poster belongs to COSATU, which was a trade union for workers. Now, let's look at another example which is slightly different from what we've been looking at so far. This one is an essay. So in other words, it's based on longer writing, and you will see that there are lots of skills that come into this. So this is still on civil resistance in South Africa, 1970s to the 1980s. The question reads, explain, so you're explaining here, to what extent. Very, very important, because in your answer, you will have to give the extent. Explain to what extent P.W. Botha's attempt at reforming the policy of grand apartheid in the early 1980s was met with mass resistance by grassroots community organizations. So the content of the question, it's what you already know, because you will have dealt with short questions to help you understand that. But the important instruction words are explain and to what extent. So this is an essay question. So you need to plan and construct an original argument. It has to be your own argument based on relevant evidence using analytical and interpretative skills. Very important. So you need to indicate whether the statement is accurate or not. So this is where your extent comes in. Remember I told you before. You need to focus on how P.W. Botha's government imposed hardline reform measures and the resistance that progressive non-racial organizations embarked upon, which led to the collapse of the system of apartheid. So in other words, you're linking the question to the content. So you need to include the following aspects in response. In your introduction, take a stance. Taking a stance means you give the extent. That is very important. And then you indicate, I'm going to underline, indicate how the events unfolded in the 1980s. If you do that, you are going to do very, very well. So let's look at some points that you can include. P.W. Botha launched the Total Strategy and Total Onslaught policies. Botha's attempts to reform apartheid by introducing the tricameral parliament in 1983. The formation and response of the UDF to the tricameral parliamentary system. The intensification of the internal resistance, e.g. violent protests in the Vaal Triangle and elsewhere in South Africa. The Vaal Civic Association organized rent boycotts, so that comes from your own knowledge. The Vaal townships embarked on a rolling mass action. Councillors were killed, schools went on boycotts. The role of Black Sash, very important. They opposed apartheid, gave humanitarian aid to victims of apartheid. The role and impact of the Mass Democratic Movement, MDM, in resisting P.W. Botha's regime. And then when you get to your conclusion now, because all these points will be in your paragraphs, different paragraphs that you write in your essay. So you have your introduction where you've taken a stance, and then now you have different paragraphs where you elaborate, including all these points. Now, when you are concluding, remember it's a separate paragraph, this is where you have to sum up your argument. And summing up does not mean repeating everything you've said. So in other words, you sum up. Remember, when you're summing up, you need to go back to the stance as well. You can't move away. If in your introduction you said to a large extent, you can't then in your conclusion say to a small extent. The conclusion has to be in line with the introduction. In other words, it also has to say to a large extent, just like the introduction. So you have to have a relevant conclusion as well. Another very important thing to note in the conclusion, because the word says sum up, you are summing up your argument. Please make sure that you do not include new ideas. No new ideas here should be included. It should be all the information that or the words and evidence that was discussed in the body of your essay, in the different paragraphs of your essay. If there is something that should have been in the paragraphs of the essay, but then you forgot to mention, please make sure that you do not mention it in the conclusion, because the conclusion says, I'm done with the argument now, I am now summing up. In other words, putting everything together. Just like the introduction says, I'm introducing the subject before I deal with the specific evidence. Another thing to note is, please do not write your entire essay in the introduction. The same as with the conclusion, do not write your entire essay. You will do that in your paragraphs after you've written the introduction. And then in the conclusion, you sum up your main points. I hope that has helped you understand how to answer these long questions, which can be a bit intimidating at times and daunting, but can be very easy if you follow these instructions and do exactly what you are asked to do, instead of giving irrelevant information or not taking a stand by giving the extent and also including relevant and new information in your conclusion instead of summing up. So we are going to take another commercial break, and when we come back from the break, we are going to wrap up, by just recapping on what today's lesson was about, so that you remember what to focus on and how to apply your skills to succeed in your exams. I will see you straight after the break. Welcome back. So to conclude today's lesson, I just want to remind you of where we started. Remember, we looked at the civil society protests in South Africa and the different subsections that you have to know, because your exam questions can come from any of these sections. Please make sure that you do not only study one. You have to know all of them. We also looked at essential skills in history, like knowing your historical concepts, defining words in your own terms, analyzing posters, interpreting sources, looking at usefulness and limitations, and extracting relevant evidence from the sources. I also told you about the key words or historical concepts that are very important to know and to be able to define in your own words, like black consciousness, uprising, reform, constitution, repression, trade union, homeland, all important, civic organization, sanctions, disinvestments. Please make sure you know them. Remember, I also told you that the common errors that students make is not seeing cause and effect. Struggle to interpret sources, cannot explain historical terms in own words, very important. Also, analyze posters, look for those visual clues. That's another very important thing. And also identify limitations of sources. Remember, I told you reading the caption is very important in order to analyze those sources. Okay, we also looked at exam writing competencies, because coupled with your essential skills in history, you need to know how to be prepared for the exam. Visual source analysis, very important. Reading skills, so that you understand exactly what the question is asking of you. Critical thinking, that is how you are going to understand the sources. Manage your time properly. If a question is out of 2 marks, do not spend more than 2 minutes on it. How to interpret sources, communication skills, comprehension. We also looked at active learning skills. That also goes with interpreting your questions and comprehending them. Now, as a bonus, to help you apply all the skills that I've shown you today, I'm giving you questions like 1.1.3, 1.4.1, 2.1, 1.2.3 and 1.3. These questions come from the November 2022 exam, and you just have to focus on sources 1A and 1B. Those are the questions that are going to help you to apply the skills that I've taught you today, so that you are well prepared for the examination. I hope today's lesson has helped you understand not only how to analyze questions in history, but also how to prepare for your exams so that you are successful and you get those results you deserve. So I wish you all the best. Make us proud. Until we meet again, it's goodbye from me.